Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the Brown Women's Network and the Brown Alumni Lifelong Learning Program for a conversation with alumna author Xochitl Gonzalez, class of 99. Tonight's event is presented by the Brown Alumni Lifelong Learning Program and the Brown Women's Network, and proudly co-sponsored by the Brown University Latino Alumni Council, BULAC, as we celebrate National Hispanic Heritage Month. Our Alumni Lifelong Learning Program aims to expand the ways alumni can continue to learn from Brown faculty and alumni experts on location, online, and on campus. This event is part of our Alumni Author Series, which provides alumni the opportunity to share their research, knowledge, and creative works with the Brown community. I am Ana Bermudez, class of 86, and proud parent of a member of the class of 2022, and co-chair of the Brown Women's Network. The Brown Women's Network aims to keep the Brown alumni, student, and staff community connected and engaged by offering a variety of programming throughout the year for those interested in tapping into our shared Brown roots for lifelong social, professional, and intellectual development. To learn more about BWN, please visit our website or follow us on social media. Tonight, we're thrilled to welcome Xochitl Gonzalez, class of 1999, in conversation with Brown alumni Rebecca Blandón, class of 2016, as they discuss Xochitl's acclaimed work. See, I'm trying to speak in Spanish as part of this. Following the panel discussion, we will host a brief audience Q&A as Xochitl answers your questions. Please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A feature throughout tonight's conversation. At this time, I am excited to welcome tonight's moderator, Rebecca Blandón. Rebecca is a documentary filmmaker, editor, and producer. She worked for PBS Frontline, the New York Times, and the Boston Globe. She's currently working on a PBS documentary series about caregiving in America at a small social justice-driven production company called ARC Media in New York City. Born and raised in the Bronx to Nicaraguan parents, she graduated from Brown in 2016 with a bachelor's in neuroscience and also pursued her master's in journalism at NYU. Is that not a Brown trajectory or what? In her lifetime, she hopes to make what is invisible visible through the practice of compassionate storytelling, accountability journalism, and documentary filmmaking. Through her work, she likes to explore and honor our human connections to death, isolation, meaning, identity, and freedom. Thank you for joining us this evening, Rebecca.
Thank you.
And please join me in welcoming our featured speaker this evening, Xochitl Gonzalez. Xochitl is a writer, producer, cultural critic, and the New York Times bestselling author of the novel Olga Dies Dreaming, named a best of 2022 by the New York Times, Kirkus, NPR, Time, GQ, and more. She's a staff writer at The Atlantic, where her work about gentrification, race, and class was recognized as a 2023 finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in commentary. Her most recent novel, Anita de Monte Laughs Last, follows a first-gen student at Brown in the 1990s and was published on March 5th, 2024 by Flatiron Books. A native Brooklynite and public school graduate, Xochitl currently serves as a trustee of the corporation at Brown. Now I am happy to turn it over to Xochitl. Take it away.
Oh, thank you, Ana. And I love that you turned to Spanish. I love it. Thanks for having me. This is wonderful. And actually, I was a a mentor through the Women's Network for a while. And I loved it. It was such a great program to get to do. So I'm going to. I pulled an audible on myself, and I changed my mind at the very last minute about what I was going to read. So this book follows two characters. The titular Anita de Monte, who was inspired by the life and death of Ana Mendieta, but is obviously fictionalized as it's in the first person from her death. No spoilers. And then Raquel, who is a Latina art history student at Brown. And so the section I'm going to read from is actually a little later in the book. I've never read this section before, but I thought since Raquel is a student at Brown, and some people might be able to relate. I am writing about a visit from her mom and her sister coming up from Brooklyn that happens about two-thirds of the way through the book. And, obviously, a lot of this book was kind of inspired by my experiences, some of my friends' experiences, and just this sort of clashing of worlds. As Raquel, I think at this point it's the summer between her junior and her senior year, so she sort of knows who she is at Brown, and now it's like her Brooklyn family is coming in, and it's always that tension between the two things. So Raquel in Providence in the summer of 1998, she's in her little apartment off of Ives Street. Mira que flaca, her mother said when Raquel opened the door. She leaned in to kiss her. I thought you told me you'd been eating. Hello to you too, Raquel said, though all afternoon she'd been anticipating this, steeling herself for the sharp edge of her mother's raw words. Rocky, she bellowed from as she beelined towards the kitchen, hands full of shopping bags. We talked about this. It's a slippery slope. It's summertime, Mommy, her sister interjected, giving Raquel a hug as she walked through the living room and followed her mother into the kitchen. She plopped down in the little nook Raquel had found so charming. Nobody wants to eat in this summer but you, Miss Thick. This place is mad cute, Rocky. I still need to show you the rest, Raquel said, grateful for her sister's presence. We have a back porch. Her mother was at the counter unpacking Bustelo and plantain and Utz chips, opening cabinet after cabinet, trying to make heads or tails out of this place. Raquel was surprised how examined it made her feel to have her mother rifling through her kitchen. No wonder you're so skinny. There's no food in there. I can put that stuff away, Mommy, Raquel said, steering her mother away from the cabinets and towards the table. I'm just trying to find your pantry. Just relax, have a beer. Let me show you around. Sure, her mother said, but her body language was defensive. She decided to ignore it. Grabbed a beer for her mother from the fridge. What's up with your hair? Her mother said, lips pursed in disapproval. Raquel was still dressed for work. Black pencil skirt, black tank top, her hair pulled back into the chic bun that had become what she thought of as her signature look that summer. The look that kept her hot and sticky hair out of Nick's face and, as he told her, showed off her beauty. Oh my God, Raquel said as she handed her mother the drink. Is this going to be the whole weekend, you picking at me? I'm not picking at you, her mother said. You have beautiful hair. It's a chignon, Raquel said, now feeling defensive. It looks like you clean houses for a living. Enough, Tony interjected before turning to her mother. You need to calm down and stop taking your insecurities out on innocent people. Mira, the way my kids talk to me now. Instead of picking on her, tell Raquel what you told me in the car. What are you, Tony, a narc? Her mother said, turning her body away in a huff like a defiant pug as she muttered about her disrespectful daughters, her face as lovely or as miserable as whatever feeling she wore inside herself. Raquel, Mommy's been having feelings about you having your own place and growing away from her. You don't need to put words into my mouth, Tony, her mother yelled. I can talk for myself. But actually, her voice was breaking. Her gray eyes were glassy and her lips started trembling, and Raquel felt her heart breaking a little bit because she could feel all the things her mother's chest pushing up and not knowing how to find a way out. The frustration at feelings unable to attach themselves to words. How many of their fights had been the result of the same incapacity? Raquel sat at the table next to her mother and put her petite hand on her mother's plump forearm. Mommy, it's okay, she said. Just say whatever you want. It's just that, her mother said, and now she was fully choking on the tears. If you can do all this for yourself, what do you need me for anymore? The question punched Raquel in the chest, knocked the air out of her. She threw herself onto her mother. No, Mommy, she said, tears now welling in her own eyes. Don't say that. And she didn't want her to say it because it hurt too much to hear the truth, to watch her absorb what Raquel had felt for 3 years now. She didn't really need her. Not to cook for her or clothe her or pay a bill or remind her to succeed or do her homework. She wished, actively, often, that her mother could be someone she could call for help, that she could understand her ambitions, the world she was in and day out, wished often that her mother could comfort her or give her advice, but she knew she was ill-equipped. Raquel was on her own in that regard. The apartment was just a symbol of what she already knew. She could live without her mother. And she hated that, but she hated it more that her mother knew it now, too. She draped her body on top of her mother to calm and quiet her, to muffle the sound of veracity of it all. Because if you two don't need me anymore, her mother said, now heaving with sobs, I don't know what to do with myself. You're my whole life. Tony, tears streaming down her heart-shaped face, threw her arms around her mother. Mommy, don't be crazy, she said. We'll always need you. But Raquel couldn't lie. And instead she just said, you'll sit back and relax and be proud of what you did, of the 2 women you raised all by yourself. but that just made the mother cry more. And now, not even 15 minutes into their visit, all three Toro women were collapsed on one another, sobbing and muttering about how much they loved one another and apologies and how fantastic the apartment was and what a nice job Raquel had done decorating it, nice and classy. Indeed, who knows how long they would have stayed in this tear-stained, love-filled heap had Marcus, fresh from his own drive up from the city, not walked in. Well, hello, ladies, Marcus said awkwardly. Am I interrupting something? That's it. Thanks.
That was beautiful.
I love her mother. I'm like, I never read that, even though I loved her mother as a character, who was like very inspired by my grandmother.
Yeah, well, I love that you also chose this moment because it's almost like an overlap between worlds, right?
Yeah.
I remember having the same experience when my parents would come visit me, and it was like this other world that still exists,
Yeah.
still a part of me, but you almost become a different person in that moment too, because you have to hold both of them at the same time.
Well, I think it was so sorry, and I'll let you actually like ask your questions, but my freshman roommate and I are still really close. And it was, she's I don't know, white upper middle class woman from Long Island, and we're really good friends. And she texted me after she read the book for the first time, and she was like, "I didn't realize we had such different experiences." But
Mm.
like, I think that I wanted that scene because I feel like when people hear like, "Oh, campus novel," like they imagine their own feelings about like, "Oh, I would love my parents to come visit," but actually, it's like was very stressful.
Yeah.
It was like this really stressful thing, right? Like you're like, "Oh my God, they're coming up. Like, am I gonna see who can we hang out with? Who should we not see? Like, what do we do?" And so I wanted the visit. The visit felt important to understand, you know, her. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love the details, the bustelo, the plátano chips. It's so real. There's
All the
never a
stuff that you
day.
miss, yeah, like you're like, I can't find it.
It's so cute. Well, yeah, I guess I can dive into some questions unless you wanted to share anything else about that moment. Was it inspired, I'm curious, by a memory, a very specific memory between you and your mom and your sister?
No, I don't even have a sister. I always write characters with siblings, and I'm an only child. And I wasn't raised by my mom. I was raised by my grandparents. And my grandmother just really resented Brown. Like she hated
Mm.
it. Like
Mm.
she detested it. And she felt like every year she hated it more because I was like changing, and then it was like making
Mm.
her feel intimidated, and it was like this like wedge between us in this very funny way that I don't know that she ever fully got over, to be totally honest. Like she just sort of hated it, and it made her feel uncomfortable and out of place, and like she was very, I think I wanted to put that thing where it's like, her mother has these feelings and she can't find words to express them. And that was definitely like my grandmother's, problem. I think right now we're in a time where we talk about our feelings so much, and we talk about like trauma and inherited trauma and blah, blah, blah. And my grandmother was like an orphan and like had no skill sets, so like a lot of the time things would turn into a fight, and you'd have to calm down and be like, she just doesn't know how to talk about it, you know what I mean, like what she's
Mm.
really thinking. And I think that's a different distance, right? Like, and I I definitely, it wasn't until I wrote this book, and that wasn't the intention. I don't really write them as therapy. I was like, I usually have a bigger idea, but like, it wasn't until I wrote this book that I realized that there's that other sort of divorce in the experience of kind of like coming in, like either first gen or low income or whatever, is that
Mhm.
your family can't relate to it. So you lose them as like a vibe. I don't know. Right? Like you're like, okay, like it's like, I can't really talk to you about what's happening because you don't get it. Like, and like, but I don't want to then make you say, oh, you're not going to understand, because then that hurts your feeling. And so like you end up performing for your family in some funny way, and like, and I just sort of wanted to explore that. Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's definitely like translating between worlds.
Yeah,
I'm feeling that now. I feel like a lot of us in our own way too have to learn to bridge what we learn at Brown and like how we learn at Brown with the way that we communicate with our parents and our families. And the way we approach life, right? And
Yeah.
passions. So I guess to bring it back to Brown and the way that we learn, I'm curious if there were any classes or how you were able to kind of use the open curriculum to explore this story, and if there were any memories from that time at Brown that you kind of used as a foundation. Yeah, I'm just curious if there are any classes or moments in your time at Brown that really influenced.
Well, I mean, I was an art history
Novel.
major, and I did not use the open curriculum well. I mean, I don't know. I guess you can't really use it badly, but like I just really liked art history, and so I just took art history classes. Like that was all I did, and and I say I didn't use it well, and that I didn't really like venture. Like I was like I found a thing that I liked, and I kind of went with it, and so for the first time in my life, I used my major.
That's such a
Like,
Brown thing.
I never used my major to this point, so I did finally use my major.
Mhm.
And then the inspiration for the story was I don't know, is that real open curriculum? I mean, I think all of my books, like my two books, and I know what the third book is. So in my head, like I know what it is. It's like I think all of my books kind of use the Brown. They're very Brown in the sense that they are weaving seemingly disparate
Mhm.
topics and finding those connections, right? And they're using sort of interdisciplinary thinking um, they're using interdisciplinary thinking around sort of like complex problems, right? And I think I really learned to think that way at Brown. And I feel like, even in the way I always say, like, I think I learned as much from my kind of extracurriculars, like in working on, and
Mhm.
like as I did from my classes. But so I will say, like, there's a lot. I did rely heavily on my actual Brown education to write this book, in the sense that I used art and art history, and I used the inspiration really came from my senior year. My friend Siska had graduated, and she came back, and she'd given me like a Caribbean art book,
Mm.
and it was like every time I say it, I think, especially like, you're of a younger class. I'm so impressed with your bio, by the way. Like, just for you, amazing. It's so wonderful.
Oh.
But like every time I, I think back, it seems so crazy. But like, it was like, like, like if you've ever seen like a phrase and you can't make it make sense, and it was like Caribbean art, Caribbean art. Like, it was like there was just, I'd been in this art history classroom all this time, in this darkened art history classroom with totally lovely, well-intentioned teachers, like, but I never was exposed. Like, and so then you get into this brainwashed space that like art is like, murals and graffiti, and that's all that we have, and that there's
Mm.
no fine art. And so suddenly, I get this Caribbean art book, and then I'm talking about it to everybody because I can't get over this revelation. And one of the art faculty was like, "Oh, you should look up Ana Mendieta," and then this became
Mm.
this like kind of adult, lifelong like obsession and constant engagement and re-engagement and discovering and rediscovering Ana Mendieta and her story. And then as an adult, I was, my first book, I had the chance to adapt it for television, and I was like working on the TV pilot, and I was doing a notes call about the script, and it was like a note that made it very clear that we were just talking about two different aesthetics, right? Like, and that they have no understanding of the aesthetic that I am coming from. And I
Mm.
found myself really mad about my art history classroom, because suddenly I was like, well, I've been exposed to everything. I know everything that you like and look at, and I know the art that you think is good art and the films that you think are good films. I've had to see those things. You've never had to see my things. So when
Mhm.
they seem like discordant or X, Y, or Z to you, it's because you're not familiar in the visual language, or the cultural language of my culture, and because you don't have to be, but I have to be. And suddenly I felt pissed, and I felt that the lineage, like it's like instead it comes across as though, oh, like this generation is the first generation to make art, and not that we have a lineage, because it's like it was robbed from us to some extent. And like, and I saw Ana Mendieta's life not just being ended, but then like her work being sort of, downplayed and not put, like sort of erased for a long time. It felt to me more like the erasure of my right to be in the room, or my right to have my aesthetic asserted. And I felt like there's consequence to that, And so I sort of conceived of this idea of, revenge and empowerment, and these two braided stories. And then, it kind of, obviously then it's sort of, these things take on their own life-y life, right? Like,
Yeah. Well, for Raquel's story, actually, I'm curious if you went back to Brown, like what the research process was like, or was it really just kind of based on memory and like your friends? It sounds like you're still really connected to people in the Brown community, but
yeah.
did you go
Well,
back?
I'm back a lot because, I'm a trustee. And then before that, I was on the President's Leadership Council. So I've actually been back pretty consistently. Like, and so I never had to do like a special trip, but like I did go and do like a visit up into List, and like walking through the staircase and up to the studios, and like,
Favorite
I
building.
went to go look at my stall from when I had my painting stall. And then I never went back to BRU. I did that off memory. Like one of my best guy friend really was. I mean, it's barely hidden who it is. Everybody that knows, like anybody that was at Brown when I was there that knew me would know who that character is, but who Marcus was. But like, I didn't have to go back to BRU for some weird reason. Like I could picture that all in my own head, And like, I didn't really know. You know what I did? And maybe he's even on this call. I did call the hottest white guy in my class. Like, and I was like, talk to me about what it was like to be so hot, like so
Oh
young.
my
And he
gosh.
was really good at something. Like, I won't say what it is because I promised I'd protect his identity, but like he was really good at something. And so like, he was really like a hot shot at this one thing. And then he was hot, and he's like on the phone. Like, now we're like in our 40s, and I was like, I don't think I got away with anything because I was good looking. And his wife, who was also in our class, is like screaming in the background. She's like, you get away with things every day because you're good looking. So I did have like an interview because I just wanted to know, not so much, I don't think that's specific to Brown, but I think, I think it's funny, like we talk so much about women's pretty privilege, but we don't talk about like men's pretty privilege. And I kind of wanted, and so I actually, that conversation really was helpful though, because I think in the beginning, a lot of people find Nick to be a despicable character, but I just find him to be sort of confused and like postulating, and like and I think he, at the end, I don't know, it's like the Nick we meet in 10 years could go either way. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, yeah. Like he could go either way.
People
And
do.
I think things change people, right? Like it's like this incident could change him. And it's like, and so like the gift at the very end is like either it's manipulation or it's a change. And so,
Yeah.
only time would tell.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious. I think for me too, as a Brown alum, like uh learning to be intuitive about what interests you, I think it really does come from the freedom that you have as a student to explore different things, you know? So I'm curious if there's I think a lot of people think about think people expect that you choose what stories you pursue, but I feel like a lot of the time they actually kind of choose us. And
Mm,
so I'm curious if there was a moment for you in the beginning of this journey to write this novel, if there was something that kind of spoke to you, whether it was a passage of a book or an artwork, if there was kind of this inciting incident for you.
I mean,
To
no,
start
it was
writing
a
that book.
Zoom call with studio executives. And then I went it was deep pandemic. I went to get a coffee and I had the idea for the book and I wrote
Wow.
it down, and then I wrote an outline, and then I didn't have time, and I sat it in a drawer for like 2 years. I did all this research about the original draft was less fictionalized and it was like more of a script. So it was like, sort of just a braided, it was like a braided outline, like that could have gone, like I was dared to write it as a script and I did. And then I was like, I really want to write it as a book. And so then once that was more interesting
Oh,
because,
interesting.
so then I wrote it as a book or most of a book.
Mhm.
And it was like really sad. Like it was like a depressing book, actually. Like, and my best friend who went to Brown, who's like class of '00, was like, "This book is too depressing," and she's like, "I don't want to read this book," and I couldn't find the humor in it, which I generally have a very big sense of humor, so I couldn't find the humor in it, and then I was like struggling with this, and I was telling an artist friend of mine about it, and she was a Cuban American artist, and she was
Mhm.
like, I didn't know, was like obsessed with Ana Mendieta. And she was like, Ana Mendieta's ghost lives behind the American Academy of Rome, and you should go and
Mm.
see it. And then actually, a classmate of mine was running the food sustainability program at the American Academy of Rome. And so she sent me somebody's email. She's like, "Oh, made an email introduction." And I told them what I wanted to do. And they must get such weird requests because she was like, "You can come these 3 days in May." And so then I did. And like, I flew to Rome and I went to the American Academy and I FaceTimed my friend Teresita and she was like, "No, the ghost is over there." And then I just talked to the ghost and the ghost was like, "If you're going to use my story, you should use my voice. You need to use my voice." And she sounded exactly like this character did. And so I went back to New York and I revised the whole, like all of the Anita parts into first person from third person. And I realized from a craft point, in case there's any writers on this call, um, the learning thing there was she's a victim of a crime. Okay. And so there's a violence committed against this woman.
Mhm.
And the reason why there was no ability to find this funny is because the distance between like just the way our brains work is like if you were saying she did this, no matter how close, and I write very close third, like where it's almost, you feel like it's the character's consciousness. Um, the distance between it is still, you can't stop yourself from seeing her as the victim of something. So there's
Mm.
like a hovering emotional sadness, it creates this hovering emotional sadness no matter what the character is saying or doing, because you're like, oh my god, as soon as you say she, like she
Mhm.
now exists in the past, but as soon
Mm.
as it's put into her voice, she exists in the present, and you are getting her version of a past story and her current anger. And so then that enables you to also be pissed off to the point of hilarious, pissed off to the point of like rage, and now you're actively feeling things. And so like it was a really interesting technical challenge that had I not had this encounter with the ghost, I don't know that I would have thought about. Like I don't think it was the process of doing it that made me then realize like, oh, now this is a tale of empowerment and not of victimhood. And so then it just shifted energetically the whole thing.
Mm. Yeah, that's really fascinating. I love hearing a good ghost story. You have to be open to it. I feel like we all are in some way. Um, so I'm gonna start taking some of these questions. They look really good.
Okay.
Um, I'm gonna ask about, I guess, more about your process. I'm curious, actually, if you can kind of set the scene for what that even looks like. Like, do you have a place that you go to? Do you have a setup? And then do you start with note cards? I know you started with a script on this one, but and then it sounded like this ghost encounter also caused you to reshape the first person and second and where you were coming from.
So,
Um, but how do
yeah,
you get started? What does that look
um,
like? What's your process like?
each book is a little different now because I guess I'm technically starting. I'm in the midst of my four. I've started 4 books. I abandoned ship on one, and I'm like in the middle of revising a third. So they're all different. Like every process has been different, and I can tell right away what the process is going to be, which is sort of like, I don't know. That's just intuition. But like with Olga, it started as a short story, and then I realized it was a book. And then like if I were to describe the shape of it, it was a spiral, and it's like the themes of the first 3 or 4 chapters just kept repeating, and the subject matter getting bigger and bigger as the book went on. And that
Mm.
was kind of how I wrote it. I wrote it like 3 or 4, I outlined it like 3 or 4 chapters at a time,
Mm.
knowing more or less the direction it was headed, but like, and I researched it as I went, right?
Mhm.
Like I researched it as I went. With this book, I had the entire plot in my head right away, and I knew exactly what it was going to be, and I did all the research up front, and then I never looked at it again for like
Oh,
two and a
wow.
half years
Okay.
because it wasn't really important. Like it's like the point is like she was an artist that was overshadowed by him and went out of a window, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
the power was the important thing, and then I went to, and so this when I had the plot, and then I was like, it's time to figure this out, and so then I went down. And with Olga as well, I traveled. Like I went to Puerto Rico. I did revisions in Puerto Rico because I think I just was like, and actually research I didn't need to do. I was there for the earthquakes in 20,
Mm,
like, and so like I was like, but like it was good because I knew logically how everything had collapsed after Maria, right? And so
yeah.
it's like the power then means there's no this, and then that means there's no that, and then this means there's no this, and so as soon as it happened, I was I was like, oh my God, like okay, here's what's gonna happen, and it was actually like in terms of like emotional recall and like it was actually very very good. And so for this book, I had been to Cuba like in 20, oh my God, I'm forgetting what, I think it was December of 2015. Castro had just died. But I was like, I have to go back because I
Mhm.
had been in Iowa, which is, you know, where
The-
Ana Mendieta and Anita the Monte get sent on Peter Pan, right? So
Yeah.
I'd been in Iowa, and what part of what I will say this, you know, you were like, what led you to this? Ana Mendieta's story was so in my consciousness because I would walk around Iowa and be like, how the fuck was this poor little, oh, I'm probably not supposed to curse on a Brown thing. How was this poor little Cubana girl taken for like at 12, and it's freezing here, it's miserable, it's miserable in 2020. It was not an easy place. My Latino students at Iowa would come to me and be like, oh my God, like it's like all like it's so undiverse. I was like, if it was like this then, what was it like in the 60s? And I'm like, and
Mm,
it's like just the isolation of it like was shocking. And so then I was like,
mhm,
well, now I need to go back to Cuba because I need to know what it was like for her then as an adult to have been raised there and then
mhm,
come as an adult to New York. What is it like to go back to where you're from? And
mhm,
then that was probably the hardest chapter to write because it was like you don't want it to descend into travel literature, like, right?
mhm.
Like it's like, and it took me a long time to figure out how to handle it. But this book, I will say, like I knew where the plot was going, but there was so much then I had to do, um, like character work, I guess, like, and then research about place and like who is this person and how would this feel, and I think, and then for Raquel, you know, it's such a frog boil because you think womanhood was always what it is now, and then
Mm.
you have to kind of strip things back, and so I pulled out all my old diaries, like
Your diaries.
that was really helpful.
Mhm.
um I pulled out all my old diaries. I basically bought all of these. I just like had to put them away, but I had like a stack like this big of like women's magazines
Oh,
and
wow.
like hip hop magazines and like every magazine that I read at that time. And you know, because it was and it was literally so like I texted a text thread of my college girlfriends, and it was like, we are lucky we made it out alive. Like the magazine questionnaires would be like, which eating disorder is right for you? And it was like you should try bulimia. No, like it was really like so bad. Like it was so like the messaging was so bad, and it was like power was like wear a power suit. Like it was just so and I it was important to me to keep it in that time period because I felt that like my generation and maybe like your generation, like post Me Too, were having like misunderstand, like there was not a sense of what, like how we were told like things were okay. And
Mm,
like there was like almost like a sense of like in the younger generation and like my generation a little bit older of like frustration that we we were having too much empathy or whatever. And it was like I was like, I think you don't understand what we came out of, you know, like it's like it was
mhm,
evolving in real time, you know, like, and it was like really important for me to write like how write and remind people how new so many of our attitudes now are and how
mhm.
recently some of these evolutions have been. And so I really wanted to keep it in that time period, um of like, you know, like, you know, it was really still a choice of like, well, what do you think you're going to do? It's like, I think I'm going to try and get a consulting gig and then see if I meet a guy there and then we'll get married. And and that was like a real thing. And a lot of women that I knew in my class did that. Like, so, you know, but that was like a trajectory, and it was not really like, it was totally seen as normal. And I think that now like that would be seen as kind of weird. So but I wanted to stay in that time where you didn't know how to fully be. And I don't know that any of us knew how to fully be, but I think in that moment, it was like you kind of graduation was sort of getting to the end of a buffet line. And now you were like doctor, lawyer, wife. Right? So,
I hear that.
yeah.
I'm curious because I know that you've had, and I think this is also too very common for some of my friends that went to Brown, and for me too. There's almost like you live through multiple lives a little bit. You try different things, and I think that's very reminiscent of the curriculum.
Yeah. Oh,
And
totally.
I think a lot of people here, they're curious, how do you fully embrace kind of being a writer, making time for it? Maybe you have like another full-time job, but like, how do you find the time? How do you fully commit? um you were a wedding planner, you did a bunch of other things. How did you make that leap?
Yeah, okay. So Deb, oh my gosh, why am I blanking? Blue Lobster. If somebody knows Deb in the chat, please put Deb's last name because I'm so annoyed with myself right now. But anyway, okay, I think my business partner in my wedding planning business. Well, first of all, I never wanted to have a wedding planning business. Like I didn't like say like, oh, I want to have a wedding planning business. Like I literally like fell down a hole and suddenly was in a very successful wedding planning business. And then there was a recession and I owed the bank money because I had a line of credit and now I'm like a slave to Chase Bank and like I don't want to be a wedding planner at all. But you can't get out of it. Like you're in this cul-de-sac because your life is planned a year more in advance, right? And you're like, and you have contracts and blah, blah, blah. And so, but we wanted to try and get out of it. And so I had this conversation, Deb Mills Schofield. Okay. So Deb Mills Schofield, who has this, she's amazing. She's been a mentor to many, 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 many alumna. I met her at the Brown 125 or the Pembroke 125, like the 125th anniversary of Pembroke. And I was like, can you talk? We don't know what to do. I've got to get out of this. Like, I just liked her. And she got on the phone with us and she gave me the best advice like I've ever gotten, which was, she was like, nothing is new. Like you have experiences and then you're just applying them to something else. And you're just taking these skill sets that you've cultivated and you're just turning them to something else. Now, the problem is in the real world, people are so limited and they want everything to be so linear that you often meet up with people that are like, but you did weddings, like how could you do this? And so I worked really hard to like cultivate a resume by doing volunteer things and all this other stuff that sort of then made sense to somebody. And then I just needed a job where they put my dog dish out with my food every 2 weeks, like, and I didn't have to hustle and hunt people down for money. And so that I could think, like a room of one's own. I just wrote the introduction for the Penguin Classics re-edition of A Room of One's Own, and I was like, I just always thought that's so obvious because like if you were hunting people down for your money, it's very difficult to be creative. And so I was like, I got to get out of here. We started doing corporate events. Like we expanded the business. We brought in staff. Like, we started doing other things and they were interesting, but I really wanted to write. And I was like, I think I need to get a normal job, like where I'm not hunting all the time so that I can think. And because of all that volunteer work, like I was able to get a job as a fundraiser, right? Like, and so like that, but it was a lot of work to be able to get that resume so that other people could see. But really, wouldn't I be the best fundraiser? I'd been selling my services to wealthy people. I can ask them for money all the time. I'd been doing it for 15 years. So it was like if somebody thought about it in a different way, it actually makes perfect sense. And then everything that I'd done to that point is in every single story that I have ever written, including my nonfiction. Like it's like I don't think there's an experience that I don't like bring. Like I'm doing a story right now about like rich sex kink and like sex clubs and stuff. And like and I was like, by the end I was like, oh, you're just running a hospitality business. It's like everything ends up feeling relatable when you look at it as like I have experiences to relate to you or to translate to this. But I think that was sort of, I will say that that's something I think I learned at Brown because you were taught to sort of see connections and things. And I think that you're looking for constellations and patterns, and your brain is getting fired up in this class when you're seeing something, in comparative lit that you're then seeing, here in political science and like, or urban studies or whatever. And like, you're like, oh my God, the world makes sense. And that I think is a way of looking at things. And that is, absolutely. I mean, I think so socially, it was a challenging time to be at Brown, but educationally, I think it's it was a life-changing education.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way. It's so funny because I didn't realize how much of an experience how similar I feel like that experience is to all of us, because I talk to other people from other schools and they're like, oh well, that's a STEM thing, or
Yeah.
now I'm reading a literary art, but like a literary book, and I really do think it's kind of all encapsulated in the same thing.
Well, I think the other thing is that, like, having gone to graduate school in a giant university where everybody had like all these requirements and stuff, like, the dental students hung out with the dental students, the pre-dental students hung out with the pre-dental students, like, it's like, whereas like we also were meeting people doing other things, and
Mhm.
like we were just getting exposed to different things, even if they weren't our lines of study, like it's like, you're like, oh, that's so interesting. And somebody will talk to you about the thing that they're working on. And then you might then now find yourself more curious. Like if they're doing some kind of cancer research and you see an article about that, you're like, oh, like you just found yourself more exposed to information about lots of different things because you're cross pollinating in these other areas, which I just always thought was so cool.
Yeah. There's a few other really cool questions here. I know I did want to talk a little bit about magical realism and um, kind of how you infused your heritage, your spirituality, and also your research in the novel.
So I buck against the term magical realism.
Okay.
It's the writing that was required to tell the story the way the story
Mm,
needed to be told.
mhm,
She's dead. Why would death be like reality?
mm,
Like it's
mhm,
another world. Like I don't think I was like, I'm gonna do some Marquez. Like I think it was like, like I think it's a term that we put on Latino people whenever they're taking a story into a realm outside of the realm of the real,
mhm,
and it's
mhm,
like it's actually what the story calls for. And I think it's like, why would her, I just didn't believe her death would resemble white Anglo heaven.
mhm,
Like, and so
mhm,
then to that point I did research, right? And it was like the bat is part of Taino death mythology, that bats are how people come visit us. And then I
mhm,
expanded upon that. The ceiba was both in Taino culture as well as in Santeria. And like, and so you know, I obviously I know about my saints and my like you have Yemaya, and like there's a lot of Santeria woven in this, that whether you, if you know it, you see it and you feel it, and if you don't need to, and it won't be lost on you. You won't be lost. You'll hopefully just appreciate the visuals and not necessarily, you don't might not get the symbolism, but like, she, instead of death, she goes back to the womb of her mother Yemaya. And so that was important to
mhm,
me, and that some of that I knew, some of that was research. I spent a lot of time reading Patakis. I read the Altar of My Soul, which is a beautiful, beautiful book. Um, and and Patakis are basically like allegories, like in Santeria, to teach lessons. So I did a lot of research, and then I kind of was created the rules of her death world, right? Like so. But I think it was kind of like, okay, she goes out this window and she's talking from the afterlife, so I have to keep it going. And then
mhm,
it's like, you're like, well, she has the spirituality. What would make sense? And I was like, she's going to return to her spiritual mother, right? And so
mhm,
like that makes sense. But I think, it's, to me, I think when you call it magical realism, the reason I buck about this is like, it makes it seem like first person, third person magical realism. Like it's a technical choice, and it's like the story required it.
mhm,
Like, it's like the story required it. Like technically in my first book, there's a time jump at the very end that qualifies it as like technically as speculative fiction. But that's not speculative fiction. It's just what the story required, right? Like, and so I think like sometimes we get over obsessed with genre. Like somebody classified this book on Goodreads as, and then I promise I stopped torturing myself by going on, as like historical fiction. And I'm like, no, historical fiction is when it's very obsessed with the details of the time, right? Like
mhm,
it's like this is like just enough to set the tone and the mindset, right? Like
mhm,
it's not meant to like be built into the time. It's about the story, and then like it's like setting. Like, and so I think sometimes we get obsessed with like these genre terms, but particularly I think it's a heavy label that gets thrown onto Latino writers that diminishes the frame of the story. I think that our reality is seen as having multi dimensions, and that's the way a lot of our
Mm.
families think and talk. And so that's why you see it more often with Latino people, Latino writers. But I resist it as like a genre choice because it's what the story needed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I hear you.
Sorry, you happen to like pick my soapbox. Like
No, no, this is no, it's true because I feel like there everything is always relative. So a lot of the language that we use is relative to kind of what's been studied and what's been, sort of deemed as like the language,
yeah,
the
can
correct
I
language
talk
to
about
describe
no,
something,
totally. And I
in
want to say something
history,
actually that I've been
art.
thinking about a lot. Yeah, but like, because I got an MFA, but like I was a very loosey-goosey program, okay? Like you take one class and it's workshop. And
It's
like
art. It's art.
it's no, like, like
No?
there's a lot of other MFA programs where they're having you take literature classes and this and that. And like, I
Mhm,
was an art history weirdo. Like, I just was always in the art history department. I liked
mhm,
comp lit. I took some
mhm.
comp lit classes. I was always just a reader, like a subway reader, right? Like, I was always reading, but I was a subway reader. So I think sometimes when I resist these things, it's because they're academic terms from literature study applied to art, and I'm
Mhm.
not an academically trained artist. Like, I'm the first person to say I'm a instinct based, academically polished artist, right? Like, I learned a lot of craft things in my MFA from a couple of my wonderful teachers there, but like I didn't spend 10 years aspiring to be a writer and reading closely, like the every book that was nominated for the NBA, like, which isn't to diminish the doing of that, but that's not like, I think my writing is probably a little bit more just visceral and instinctual in that sense. And so like I
Mhm.
think part of why when I'm like magical realism, like I didn't like, I love my Marquez, but as a reader, you know what I mean? Like it's like I just like loved it as a reader. And like whereas like once I started professionally trying to be a writer, which is not a long journey, to be completely honest, like I've gotten very lucky. I find that like I read a little, like sometimes I read for pleasure and sometimes I read for craft, you know what I mean? Like it's like I'm reading to study. And so I don't think, and it's okay. It's like I actually kind of discovered this about myself. But to your point, the reason I want to bring it up is because I think people sometimes have like these dreams and aspirations, and they're like, but I can't do that. People work so many years to try to do this thing, and like whatever, and then they talk themselves out of it, out of pursuing something because they don't feel qualified. And I think the
Mhm.
truth of the matter is, by that measure, I'm not qualified. Like I'm not nearly as read as some of my peers because I was reading Stephen King. Like and I like and they're like, have you read Secret Nunez yet? And I'm like, I haven't gotten to it. But then like last year I was judging the Penn Faulkner, and it's like if you're a reader and you've been a lifelong reader and you love novels and you can probably write, you have a sense of story and you have a sense of arc and you have a sense of the rhythm of a book, and like I think that sometimes my BA and my MFA changed my life trajectory. So it's not to diminish education, but sometimes I think we can get intimidated out of trying things because we feel that we need too much accreditation. And I would just say to people not to let that happen with art.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm curious too how, and I think maybe this relates a little bit to like Raquel's experience with her thesis advisor. How do you learn to trust your voice? How do you know if a story is meant to be told? And sometimes I think, you know, um, we can feel kind of weighed down by like the
Yeah.
trauma that we're exploring, or we feel so angry that we can't even kind of just create something out of it, or we feel gaslighted,
Yeah.
where we think somebody's telling us this isn't worth it, don't pursue this creatively. I'm curious if you have any sort of like totems or any anchors any strategies that you have to trust, to always trust your creative voice, no
Yeah.
matter kind of the noise around
So
you.
I guess I would probably say first, like when we started the journey of being like, how do we get out of this cul-de-sac? I had read this book called The Seat of the Soul by Gary Zukov. And then somehow that got me on this journey of meditating. And so I started meditating, and that got me much better at listening to myself,
Mm,
actually. And now, to be honest, I actually don't, my practice is iffy because writing becomes kind of a meditation,
mm,
and you spend this time listening to the rhythm of your like instinct, you know what I mean? Like,
mhm,
and I think, and I want to say this, like, I because I have too many jobs. I write books, and then I work at the Atlantic, and then I write scripts. I write a lot. Like, I
mhm,
am at the desk the way that I used to be at a job, right? Like, and I'm toggling between things sometimes, but like I think that the sitting in it and the being in the process, like, you can't help but start to develop a sense of like, yes, no. Or sometimes it's like, this is getting boring, or this is like, like, and then you read other people's work, right? And you watch other people's films, and you're just like, you're looking at like, when is this dragging? Why does this feel like it's dragging? You have to start to observe creatively, that is. But I think in general, you need that time. For me in the beginning it was meditation, and now it's the writing itself that like is like dropping into your gut in some way, and then the more you do it, the more refined it is. And I
mhm,
think well, getting rid of the phone, like, like not being on the phone is
mhm.
probably the biggest help, like, right, like, because you're pure. And I think being outside, the walks, like all that stuff, but like, I will say, like, the doing obviously makes you more, but in the beginning it was really meditating, honestly, like. And it's not, I didn't do an app or anything, like I just was like, I read this book. I was like, kind of like, let's just see how long I can sit here. And
Mhm.
like, I was like, I went to a couple of like little classes or whatever, but like it did help me get like, okay, like, this is what I want to do. Like, and even when I was like, I want to write, and my friends were like a hobby, right? But in my head, in my gut, I shouldn't say my head, in my body, I was like, I think I could write a best-selling book. And then I was like, I'm not going to worry, and I'm not going to explain it. I'm just going to start to do it.
Mm.
And like, and then, like, I don't know, but it was like, had I not, and then once I got the writing, kind of has replaced the meditation in some funny way. But like, but there is still that thing where you're like, the other day I abandoned ship on a story for the magazine because I was like, I just don't think this is a story. Like, it's like, like, it was about corruption, and I was like, I think we already know. Like, because sometimes you're like, oh, that's an interesting detail, and then you sit on it and you're like, maybe it's not that interesting, right? Like,
Mhm.
yeah. And like, and if the question keeps coming up, like, then usually that's the thing to listen to, the question in your own head, right? Yeah.
The question of, should I just let this
Like,
go?
yeah, it's like, is this really like the thing? Or is
Mhm.
this about somebody else? Like, I think, and then I would just like, you accept if it's telling you like imposter syndrome, right? Like, because like sometimes that's like, no, it's
Mhm.
usually that's something else. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But clearly, by the way, I lean into the realm of the spiritual and otherwise, like,
Yeah, I mean, I've
yeah.
never I think most people are afraid to like sit down and write. Like it's just so scary, even though people are so talented and they have such amazing, thoughts to share, and there's something there. But normally
I
I hear from a lot of my writer friends, or even for me when I'm editing, like I'm so
Yeah,
scared to just sit down.
yeah.
So I think getting into the flow is something really special, and it sounds like it does take practice, just kind of.
I think it is totally a practice, but I also would say, like, I think in the beginning it's good to apply to things,
Mm,
like apply to contests, or like,
mm,
apply to fellowships, or apply to like a summer, there's a ton of these adult summer writing programs, because then it justifies, I think, especially for women. Sometimes we feel bad if we're taking our time away from caring for somebody or doing something, and like, and so like, if you have a deadline, you have a thing to be accountable to, and then you're like, well, I'm just applying to this thing, it's only up until I finish doing this, and then I'll go back to my real life. And then like, you accumulate enough of these things, and then suddenly you have a writing practice. And so like, I say apply to things, like that was very helpful.
okay, great. I think we're kind of coming to a close. I guess, do you have any last thoughts that you want to share? Maybe kind of like, I mean, I didn't ask you maybe what the most challenging aspect of creating this piece
This
was.
was like a very hard book. Like, I'm not gonna lie, like, for a lot of reasons. Like, um, my next book is like Olga was fun to write. Like minus like once we got into the hurricane for anybody that's read it, but but up until then it was so much fun to write. Like I had so much fun writing that wedding. Like there's a wedding in there. I had a blast writing Olga. But this was really rough, like because it was like mining a lot of difficult things about
Mhm.
relationships, about like being in a relationship with an artist. It was like, and then technically it was like shooting two films. Like I basically wrote two books and then I had to cut them together and figure out where the breaks should be and then how you should trim. And so like I think the original draft was 460 something pages, right? Like and so it was literally two books. And then you're well, and I thought of it as a film, like, because like I learned a lot when I was editing the pilot. Like, I mean, I developed terrible sciatica working on this, editing this pilot for like 12 hours a day for like a month and a half. But like, I learned a lot about thinking about editing. And so I thought about that part more like a film, right? Like, and it was and so, but it was hard to sit in really hard feelings.
Mhm.
And so I think this was like emotionally really draining. And it's like, I think a big part about art is honesty. And
Mhm.
like getting to the honest place. Like even like that little chat piece I read in the very beginning, it's like she's basically saying she was like, she's lying to her mom, like she can't lie to her mother anymore and she doesn't need her.
Mhm.
It's like you had like it's not actually easy to write, like, because it's such an ugly thought
Mhm.
theoretically. It's not the thought we're supposed to have. And
Yeah.
so I think it takes a lot of work to write the truth. Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm. Well, thank you for writing the truth, Veritas.
Thank
I think it's
you.
beautiful for all of us to really explore our own truths too, and I hope that
Yeah.
everybody had a great time. It was so nice
Thank
meeting
you
you.
so much. Oh my
You.
God.
You're
I'm
such an
so,
inspiration.
oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
That's great. Thank you, Xochitl. And see, I did it there. Xochitl and, and Rebecca for joining us this evening. One thing I do want to add, because it didn't come up, I didn't see it come up in the chat, and it's very personal to me as an outlet Latina lesbian, that you have BIPOC gayness in your books.
Yes.
And that is
Yes.
such an important, thing to see, because it just makes you feel seen for those of us who are less
Oh,
seen. So
thank you. And it's so important to me, and also the many ways in which that can express itself and can change through time, right?
yeah.
Like, yeah, yeah.
And within, in Olga in particular,
Yeah.
within a very central character,
Yes.
exploring all that, especially as a male gayness, which is also very much, because la lesbiana is always there,
Yes.
in the
Yeah.
community. So
Yeah.
anyway,
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
so I really do appreciate that. So please let us know, all of you who have come here, feedback, give us some feedback on tonight's event by participating in the survey that's going to be offered in the chat, because we always try to refine and enhance our virtual offerings. Please also follow the Brown Women's Network on social media and stay up to date for upcoming events. So on behalf of BWN and the Brown Alumni Lifelong Learning Program, thank you again for joining us this evening. I hope you had a great time, and I look forward to seeing you at future events. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you both so much. Thank you,
Bye.
everyone at Brown. Thank you.